Good evening, Mark.
Good evening there.
How are you?
Yes, good, thank you. Yourselves?
Very well. Very well. We just had a helicopter here at the ski area where our club is based, installing towers for chairlift.
Oh, wow.
An hour
Yeah.
ago, it would have been very loud in here. So it was they did it fast. They installed 4 or 5 chairlift towers in about an hour. So
Oh,
about
wow.
a week's work was done. So it's quick. A
Yeah.
lot of excitement for us. That's big news in Steamboat, Mark.
A new lift. Is it a fast one? Oh,
It'll
some
be
of the ones in
the
Park City
previous.
are a bit slow.
Yeah, the one that it replaces was over 40 years old, so it will be faster than that one. So it will be an improvement for us. So. And Mark, are you in Utah sometime part-time now as well for teaching and as well and bouncing back and forth?
Yeah, bouncing back and forth. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for fitting us in. I appreciate it. Mark, I'll wait a couple minutes after 10 our time for people to filter on here, and then I'll do a quick introduction if that sounds good for you, and then let you run with it.
That sounds great.
And we had a presentation from Jean Cote last night as well that some of our coaches were on. Yeah, so it's a good bookend. He liked that idea. He said, that's interesting. Mark's coming from the skill acquisition side. I'm coming from the psychological side. And we have a lot of crossover on the content and ideas we're working with. So I think it's a good connection.
Yeah, no, it's a good guy. I haven't seen him for quite a while actually. Probably COVID related, I suppose, to some degree. But
yeah, he was saying he's missed that time doing conferences and presenting in person so much. So I think he does a lot of that as well.
Yeah. I had one academic say to me a few months ago, he didn't realize how boring this job was until he couldn't travel.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, we missed the travel. Can you see my slides at all, Dave? Is that all right?
I can, yeah.
Great.
Thanks to everyone who's joined this morning. I'm going to give people a couple minutes to hop on after the hour here, and then we'll get started 1 or 2 minutes after 10. Mark, I'm just looking at your slides here. I was just over in Utah for a wedding up in Solitude. Top of Little Cottonwood Canyon, driving over Guardsman's Pass.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful this time of year. I've never been all the way up at the top there on the west side. I spent a lot of time on the Park City side in Deer Valley and Heber, but it's beautiful up there. It's right there on the left side of your slide there. Yeah.
That's right. No, it's a beautiful drive up through the canyon, and as you said, just coming over the top into Deer Valley. It's one of the nicest drives in the US, I would think.
Yeah. Well, I think it's 10:01, and I'd like to keep things moving and be respectful of everyone's time. So I think I will do a quick intro and get started here, Mark, if you're ready to go.
Yeah, sounds good.
Dr. Mark Williams is the chair of the Health, Kinesiology, and Recreation Department at the University of Utah and one of the world's foremost researchers and authors in the areas of skill acquisition and sport. In Mark's most recent book, The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made, which I read and have dog-eared probably 50 pages in and need to review. I was looking at it yesterday before this. I recommend it to anyone, any of our coaches and anyone with a sports club and parents. It's very interesting. In the book, he examines the research on the conditions necessary for elite athletic development. Mark will talk to us today about the environmental influences on the development of expertise and focusing on the role of siblings, family, place of birth, relative age effect, and specialization versus diversification. And I was telling Mark just when he hopped on here last night, we heard from Dr. Jean Coté as well, who comes to this topic from a different angle, from a psychological angle. Dr. Williams comes to this from research on skill acquisition and these conditions for development. And I think it's really interesting, right down to the individual practice level, which is something we talked about last year when Mark presented to us, to our coaches. But also when you just think about the role of parents and the community and any variables that we can perhaps influence here in Steamboat and with the Winter Sports Club for our programs for both elite athletic development and for broader participation. So a lot of things that are in your recent book, Mark, I think are things that we can think about and apply here. So I find this topic extremely interesting from my position as an athletic director, working with all of our coaches and sport programs. And I hope that everyone could take something from this today. Thanks for joining on 10 on a Friday here and fitting this in to all of our coaches on today. And Dr. Williams, thanks for finding the time. He's in the UK right now. I don't remember exactly where, but doing this almost around dinner time and your time across the ocean. So thanks again for finding the time between your travels and teaching and research to present to us. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Dave, particularly for the second invite to come and present. I'm actually up in the northwest of England, only just got back in the UK yesterday, actually. So I'm probably still on your time more than local time here. But last time I gave a talk, for those of you who listened in, I spoke more specifically about practice and about what some of the research evidence tells us about how we can optimize the use of practice time in regards to providing instruction, structuring practice most effectively, and providing feedback. So this talk is a little bit broader. And to some degree, I'm hoping to get through it in half an hour or so. So I'm happy to answer questions as we go along or towards the end. And if anyone like Dave has read the book, then I'm happy to really delve into any of the topics that are really covered within the book. But briefly, I aim to do three things. Firstly, to reiterate the relationship between practice and performance. To highlight some of the adaptations that occur as a result of prolonged engagement in practice, and then to consider some of the implications of this work for talent search and talent development. Over the last 20 to 30 years or so, there's been a fair amount of effort that's gone on to try and track retrospectively, normally using questionnaires and semi-structured interviews, the developmental history profiles of elite athletes. And I'm sure Jean Coté would have spoken probably quite a bit about this last night. The findings have generally been very sport specific, if I would comment. And probably most of the data from a single sport has been from soccer, but probably there are data from maybe 50 to 100 sports that have tried to map these developmental differences. But certainly in soccer, it's a sport. And the reason why I primarily focus on soccer actually is the data that we've recently gathered from skiing and published in various outlets over the last 2 or 3 years is very similar to soccer. So skiing and soccer actually seem to have very, very similar development pathways, and actually both adhere to what we call an early engagement pathway, which is distinct from a specialization pathway, which is one where athletes engage in a single sport and specialize in that sport through large numbers of hours very, very early, or a diversification pathway where athletes engage in a wide variety of different sports during development. With early engagement, typically what happens is, in the case of soccer players, they begin participating in the sport around 4 to 5 years of age. And that's the same whether it's in North America, in Europe, or South America, very similar age of first engagement. The first of engagement for elite skiers is actually even younger. So it's actually the only sport that I'm aware of where engagement occurs earlier than soccer is skiing, roughly between 2 and 3 years of age. First engagement in formal practice, usually in soccer, is around 6 or 7 with engagement in a coach and regular work. In skiing, it's again a little bit younger than that. It's maybe around 6 to 7 years of age. And then essentially, these are data here actually from the elite players who join Premier League academies in the northwest of England, whereas the sub-elite players are those who played soccer to a reasonable level, but weren't actually attached to a professional club. But even as you track through the developmental history profiles here, so we've got average hours accumulated in practice on the vertical axis, age along the bottom, then what you see is by the age of 16, the elite soccer players have accumulated around 7,000 hours of practice. They do participate in other sports, but an average of 2.2 other sports and a relatively small number of hours. It's somewhere between 5 and 10% of their total engagement in sport is spent outside of soccer. Skiers actually, as I said, they accumulate actually a similar number of hours, up to around 8,000 hours of practice in skiing by the age of 18. So very, very similar to soccer. They probably participate in more sports, I think typically between 4 and 5, and they actually accumulate quite a large number of hours. So it's certainly an early engagement pathway for skiing, possibly some element of diversity through engagement in different sports. Of course, what we really don't know is whether that engagement in other sports has any benefit in regards to the development of expertise in skiing. We know it'll give them a broader skill set, and that arguably that may help reduce overuse injury and possibly burnout. But the actual evidence around the transferability of skill actually isn't that strong. And although intuitively, anecdotally, we may feel that there may be some transfer from one sport to the other, but the state of the science is not particularly strong on it, really. And in essence, certainly in terms of these soccer players, I doubt whether the engagement in other sports has a significant impact in regards to the development of skill in soccer, given how relatively small it is. And of course, we don't have guidelines either in regards to, even when you talk about having a diversified development pathway, well, does that mean playing 2 sports a week, and you might play 4 hours in one and 1 hour in another? Or does that involve 5 or 6 sports a week, and then you may just spend an hour or 2 in each one? There's no real definition as to what is specialization and what is diversification. But typically, as I said, if you're an aspiring soccer player in most parts of the world, then said you have to engage early, invest 9 to 10 years of your life in the sport, accumulating around 800 hours per year, 16 hours per week, and around 7,500 hours around 16, 17 years of age. What we obviously need to be aware of is that it's not just about the quantity of practice, it's also about the quality of practice. And there have been efforts to try and identify whether specific types of practice activities are more beneficial than others. You know, what is the relative benefit of non-coach-led play-related activity in the sport? What is the benefit of coach-led activity, and whether that is individual or group-based, for instance? So there's some evidence that may suggest different types of practice have different types of value as far as skill development is concerned. The other thing which has attracted quite a lot of interest over the last few years is the concept of deliberate practice. Now, deliberate practice would be viewed as engagement in a specific activity with the intention of improving some aspect of performance. And this will be a little bit different from the mere accumulation of experience on a sport or in a task. Whereas with deliberate practice, efforts are made to try and specifically identify what are the skill sets that the individual athlete needs to work on. So on this graph here, for instance, what we have on the vertical axis, we have performance. Along the bottom, we have deliberate practice. And the curve here is a classic learning curve. So normally what you have is a very rapid improvement initially in practice, and then a plateauing out. And the challenge with learning, in essence, is to be able to define at each stage of development what is the next specific type of activity you need to engage in order to improve performance, rather than the mere process of accumulating practice relatively passively. This, of course, can be quite difficult, particularly in a coaching context, because, you know, you may be working with a group of 16, 20 athletes. And obviously what might be one individual's deliberate practice or growth training may be another person's passive accumulation of practice or maintenance training. So I think the concept nicely highlights the need for practice to be very individualized to the strengths and weaknesses of specific individuals. Interestingly, when we've actually done some work where we've tried to observe what experts do in practice and how they differ in regards to their practice activities to non-expert athletes, what we do find is that experts do use the practice time a lot more efficiently. So typically we know, for instance, that they spend longer periods of time working on skills that they're not good at. Whereas in contrast, less expert athletes are more inclined to spend time on the skills that they're already perfected relatively well. Experts spend more mental and physical effort on the task, and they spend a lot more time engaged in self-reflection and thinking continuously about, you know, what did they do right in the last practice session, what didn't go well, what might they do differently next time. And to some degree, actually, we also find that experts reported that they often found practice to be less enjoyable. This may be a reflection of the fact that for this particular study, they were learning technical skills as opposed to playing open-sided games and free play. So that might have made it less enjoyable. Also, of course, if you're practicing on that edge between success and failure, then the chances are is that you are failing more often. And of course, that may also have some impact in terms of enjoyment. But nevertheless, distinct differences in the manner in which experts and novices go about the process of practice. Now, these sort of activities are, if you like, characterized by there being clear psychological differences between elite and sub-elite athletes as well. And when we've, across a number of sports, looked at the relationship between hours engaged in practice and certain types of psychological characteristics, we do find some distinct differences. So usually experts are higher in achievement motivation. They have stronger perfectionist tendencies. They often have higher levels of grit and mental toughness, as well as stronger resilience and coping skills. What we do not know, to be honest, is whether those who are elite athletes score higher on these psychological characteristics early in development, or whether in essence these psychological characteristics are molded and shaped by the learning and practice environment over a prolonged period of time. What we really don't have is longitudinal data that may track some of these measures early on and then see how they're influenced by extended engagement in the sport. It is likely that there is some genetic component to this, but it's also quite apparent that these are molded by the environmental factors. As to how much is it nature and how much is it nurture, we don't really know at the moment. As I said, that's why it would be nice to have some longitudinal research that tracked how some of these factors develop over time. When we do cross-sectional research, however, whatever that age group is, if we look at under 14s, under 16s, under 18s, and we create skilled and less skilled groups of athletes, using some kind of metrics of performance where possible, like fizz points, for instance, then again, we do find that the more elite athletes score higher on these kinds of measures. Clearly, it's actually not the practice itself that is important, but it's actually the adaptations that occur as a result of prolonged engagement in practice. And these adaptations are physical, they're physiological, they're sociological, they're psychological, they're biomechanical. So practice leads to specific adaptations that reflect the environment that they're actually faced with. And unfortunately, there isn't a huge, compared to other sports, there hasn't been a huge amount of research on skiing or on winter sports generally. I mean, most research, soccer has probably been the most researched sport. And I just wanted to very briefly highlight some key findings that have emerged from soccer, for instance, and kind of maybe some interesting parallels in the context of skiing. So I'm not going to touch on sort of physiological biomechanical changes, but it's clearly the fact that they occur. There are changes in anthropometry, body fat composition, body shape, muscle mass. There are obviously changes in muscles, tendons, and support structures. There are neural changes. I just want to talk a little bit about game intelligence. This notion that in a lot of team ball sports, for instance, experts are better able to perceive what's going to happen next, which gives them more time to be able to respond in the pressure of competition. So one very consistent finding, for instance, is that in a lot of sports like American football, basketball, soccer, field hockey, baseball, experts have to deal with obviously extreme time constraints because the ball is moving at very high velocities, and there just isn't enough time to process information. So this ability to pick up information early to guide their actions seems to be particularly important. One of a consistent finding is that experts are better able to pick up information from the body shape of an opponent before, for instance, ball-foot contact. So it could, for instance, be the positioning of the non-kicking foot or the orientation of the hips that allows them to be able to anticipate what will happen next. And that's a pretty resilient and robust finding. We also know that when we show patterns of play from these team sports, soccer, basketball, American football, that experts are better able to identify familiarity, structures and patterns in these evolving sequences of play, whereas less skilled players just see a collection of individual players running around on a field of play and aren't able to attest any structure to them. Now, the advantage of this being able to pick up this structure or to recognize patterns early on it allows these players to be able to anticipate what the end product of that sequence would be before it happened. So it seems to be an important skill that underpins anticipation. There's also been quite a lot of work over the last few years to try and record gaze behaviors. So when I first started off in this field about 30, 40 years ago, it was a very, very difficult technical task to record what the eyes were doing. Now we have these portable glasses, which, as you can see, are not much bigger than a pair of sunglasses, where you can wear, and they allow us to identify where people are fixating their gaze. So typically we look at where people look, how long they look there for, and whether they look at patterns in any particular sequence or structure. And what we find here is that there are clear differences in the manner in which experts and novices use the visual system to extract information from the display. There actually has been one study on skiing, but it hasn't been a lot of work. So I guess in regards to play, we don't have postural cues so much in skiing, for instance, but they could potentially be replaced by environmental cues, for instance. So you could argue that elite skiers may be better up at picking up the contour, the lay of the land, the slopes, the quality of the snow by picking up this information through these environmental cues from the snow conditions. There may also be some information that conveys broader patterns, whether those patterns refer to the terrain of the land, or obviously there may be patterns also in terms of placements and alignment as someone goes down a slope. It's also interesting, of course, where these elite downhill skiers, for instance, may fixate their gaze. How far ahead do they look? To what extent do they look at the ski post in front of them, for instance, or to what extent do they look at an area of free space beyond that? So there's a lot of interesting questions that could be looked at in terms of how do elite skiers perceive, anticipate, and decide on the appropriate course of action when they traverse down the slopes, and how do they use the visual system in an efficient and effective manner in order to be able to gather and process information. Most of these things above relate to the ability of experts to actually process information in the scene as the action unfolds. But we also know that experts build up a higher level contextual knowledge about the sport that they're engaged in. So for instance, one way that we've looked at this in soccer is I might show you a clip of film for 15 seconds. I might pause it. I might highlight the player in possession of the ball in this top left-hand corner here. And I might say to you, look, who's most likely to receive the pass next? And what are the chances of each of these passes occurring? So therefore, what they've done is they've built up a hierarchy of probabilities that gives them some indication of, given the context and the situation, what is most or less likely to occur next. So what we have, therefore, is this kind of the ability to be game intelligent is a combination of the development of these higher level cognitive knowledge structures underpinned by the more appropriate processing of information as the action unfolds. So said, a lot of work done in other sports, increasing effort to develop more realistic simulations to capture these, the use of 360-degree video, the use of virtual reality. I know that US skiing has been using virtual reality over the last few years. Although again, we don't quite know at the moment how this VR technology can be used most optimally to develop skill, but certainly has potentially a lot of mileage. So what are the implications for talent search? I know David suggested that there isn't a huge amount of investment in talent search at your club, which I think is probably a good thing. The reason being is that, for many sports, it's very difficult to define the technical and tactical skills that underpin superior performance. And there have been some efforts to kind of look at things from a disciplinary perspective in regards to questions like, you know, are there key physical predictors, height, weight, body size, body fat, muscle girth, somatotype, etc.? Are there physiological markers such as aerobic capacity, anaerobic endurance and power? Are there some social economical factors around background and culture, or even psychological factors around some of the measures that are suggested before: grit, resilience, mental toughness, creativity, self-confidence, that differentiate? And again, the difficulty we have is that if you look at any particular age group, then you probably will see differences on a number of these measures. But what we don't have is any longitudinal research work that maps out the predictive utility of any of these measures. And I think invariably what you have, this is what you call a Butler profile, and it's actually, believe it or not, from a first team player at Manchester United. And what you have on the outer edge of the circle here is a number of characteristics that the club measure and evaluate. Now, most of them are physical and anthropometric in nature. And ultimately, the way the Butler profile works is that if you score nearer the outer edge of the circle in the dark blue, light blue areas, then that's a strength. Whereas if you score more towards the middle of this circle, towards the red, then that's a weakness. So if you look up at around 10 o'clock here, you've got leg strength, for instance, is relatively low because the score's in the yellow. And then you go up a little bit, body composition at 11 o'clock, then that's quite high, that's quite in the blue. So a couple of points. I mean, when you look at each of these charts for all of the first team squad players at Manchester United, you know, they're all quite different. So while there may be possibly some minimum competencies on some of these variables, it's by all means not the case that everyone has a consistent profile. And the other thing to bear in mind with this circle is that there's almost an infinite number of characteristics and attributes that could factor into this model. If you see, most of these are physical and anthropometric. So there's very little emphasis here on some of these psychological skills or the technical and tactical issues, which therefore makes the talent identification process extremely complex and difficult. And ultimately, what we don't have, and if one was going to invest in some kind of systematic talent identification model driven by science and metrics, is you would really need to be able to collect data across an extended period of time, that you need to be collecting multidisciplinary data. And what you'd need to ascertain is whether there were some variables, for instance, in the under 8 age group that may predict those that are most likely to progress to the under 10 age group, then on to the under 12. So clearly at each age group here, what you have is a population group and a target group. So the key question, of course, is that are there any measures that differentiate between the population and the target pool? And the other challenge here, potentially, even if you had this kind of data, of course, it's that it may possibly be the case that different variables predict are more predictive at different stages of development. So there's a lot of work, for instance, which I'll come on to in a minute, that highlights that coaches and scouts are more likely to select kids that are bigger and stronger early in development from the first 3 months of the selection year. So early on, the physical and anthropometric factors are more important, whereas you could argue that later on in development, when all of these athletes have been in a systematic longitudinal training program, that the things that discriminate are more likely to be technical, tactical, or psychological in nature. So I guess the problem with these talent ID models is you may end up deselecting athletes early on based on attributes that may actually be less important later on, which of course makes it a very difficult process. So the issue is there doesn't seem to be a gene or a pool of genes or any measurable factor that can account for a large proportion of variance in performance. That is certainly the case in sort of team sports like soccer and basketball, and very technical sports like tennis, for instance, it may well be that when sports become more driven by physical and anthropometric factors, take something like long distance running, for instance, or rowing, it may well be that there are fewer slices to the circle and fewer factors that contribute a greater proportion of the variance. And in that case, then clearly talent identification becomes an easier process. But to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any research that has looked at that to any depth in terms of winter ski sports, for instance. What we know generally is that the human system adapts to training, and clearly prolonged engagement, 7.5, often over 10,000 hours of practice is needed. So clearly motivation, mental toughness, and resilience are key factors on the development process. What are the implications for talent development? Well, because talent is so difficult to identify early on, I guess the challenge would be to try and get as many kids involved in the sport as early as possible, and to try and keep them involved as long as possible. I think clearly kids that have a high level of passion and interest in the sport are more likely then to have the motivation, the commitment, and the enjoyment to stay involved. The other thing we need to do, of course, is ensure that they have the right sort of practice opportunities, and that they have the right support systems and structures to support them. So I'm going to talk about those last two things for the next 10 minutes or so, just to finish off. I spoke last time about the issue of quality of practice a great deal. I think historically across different sports and globally, there seems to be a lot of circularity in coaching. A lot of coaching is based on intuition, tradition, and emulation, on historical precedents. And, you know, there clearly is a need to move towards more evidence-based practice. And last time I kind of highlighted to you some of the 3 key stages in the instruction process, in that, you know, as coaches, we tend to convey information to the learner, structure practice so they'll have the opportunity to engage in the skill, and then provide feedback. And then I differentiated between performance and learning. And performance is what you observe during practice. And what I suggested last time is that if we provide lots of instruction and demonstrate often, do specific block practice of a single skill, and provide lots of feedback, detailed and often, then performance tends to be better in that particular practice session. But ultimately, of course, what we're most interested in is long-term learning. And in order to measure learning, we need to measure retention of skill. So does the change in performance that you see in practice, is it retained over time? And we need to measure transfer. So does the change in performance that you see in practice have some transferability to other variations of the practice session? And of course, the ultimate test of transfer, which would be competition itself. And here we've actually found the reverse case, in the sense that it's maybe a case of, well, look, what is the least amount of information that I need to give the learner so that the learner can begin to perform the skill? To what extent are the practice conditions random and variable, such that they reflect the demands of competition? And what is the least amount of feedback that I need to give the athlete so that he or she can learn more independently? So clearly the latter characteristics are more reflective of a hands-off approach to coaching, whereas the performance focus is very much more indicative of a hands-on approach. And then, you know, there's a difficult balance there between getting that balance between performance and learning. Right. In fact, I did a workshop for New York Red Bulls a few months back, and we got into this debate around performance and learning. And then it became an interesting question that was raised of whether there are some psychological factors that may determine, for instance, which athletes may be better able to deal with learning conditions as opposed to performance, or what you might call growth training compared to maintenance training. So maintenance training, it may be a stronger focus on performance. whereas a learning environment is more likely to induce growth, but at the same time, more risk of failure. So then it becomes an interesting question as to psychologically, whether some learners are better able to deal with adversity, although it's relative adversity of failure in the practice session, and to be resilient enough and have the mental toughness to bounce back from that. And whether others may be less so. And so it's that interesting question, what proportion of training should be maintenance focused and what proportion of training should be growth focused, and to what extent are there individual differences there in terms of our preferences as learners to be exposed to those types of environments.
Mark, could I just ask a question on that previous slide if there's time? So is there research suggesting that more long-term learning takes place with less information, less instruction, less structure, and less feedback? Is that what that suggests?
Yeah, I think that's the gist of it, in essence, that clearly if as a coach in any particular practice session, I'm very hands-on and I provide a lot of the information through instruction, feedback, and do repetitive block practice, then clearly performance looks better in the practice session. But because I'm helping the learner a great deal through the process. Whereas, the argument would be that ultimately these athletes have to go out and perform independently. They have to conquer the slopes on their own. So the question is, how do you wean them off that coach-led prescription? And then there becomes this challenge of, okay, what's the least amount of feedback and the least amount of instruction that I need to give them? And that is better for long-term learning and development. It creates what we might perceive to be adaptive learners. Learners who are able to think for themselves, to problem solve, and to more flexibly deal with the performance environments.
Okay, this is really interesting. I think I'm just trying to boil this down for a takeaway for our coaches. If it's possible for coaches to stand in the way of long-term learning, I think the takeaway would be to really be very conscious of the amount of information, the amount of structure in block training, and the quality of feedback, and to not overdo that and make sure that it's something that's standing in the way of the natural learning that's taking place from the environment, from the session. I'm just trying to think about how do we package this information and implement it.
Yeah, I suppose the general message would be is that sometimes less is more. And it is a difficult challenge for the coach. And in fact, I think firstly, coaches need to be aware of this differentiation between performance and learning. So what you see isn't necessarily what you get. And what do I mean by that? In the sense that a practice session could be perfect, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the learner has learnt a lot. Whereas in contrast, you could have a session that isn't visibly going particularly well, and you think this is a nightmare, but it doesn't mean that they're not learning either. So there are guidance here, and these findings are quite resilient and quite robust in the literature, okay, across a variety of different sports and domains. But clearly there isn't a recipe book here for coaching, and I think the only thing we should do is make sure that coaches are aware of this differentiation between performance and learning, and that they ought to think of it that ultimately it's the learner who has to perform the skill, and that my task as a coach is to facilitate that the development of those independent skills as best as possible. And there is a danger that potentially we do have the inclination as coaches to be too prescriptive and too hands-on. And that's a difficult challenge for coaches.
Can I pipe in real quick? And this kind of strikes me as like the way we learn anything, right? Like, kids at school, at home, and maybe a parent helping their kid with their homework, where some parents will let them struggle and the final product might not look spectacular, as opposed to when a parent hands in their kids homework, right? And they've basically given them all of the answers, right? And we as coaches, like most people kind of know, you're not supposed to do your first grader's homework, but it seems like it's in a similar world.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good parallel. Yeah, good analogy. Yeah, it's getting that balance right. And it also clearly depends on the level of athlete that you're working with as well, in the sense that, you know, what the goals and aspirations are. If at the end of the day, you just want kids to have a safe time, learn skills that are going to last them a lifetime, but that they're never going to compete, then maybe it's okay to be very prescriptive, you know, because you'll be training the athlete for that level. But clearly, if the aspirations of the athlete are to become a high level performer where you need to be creative and adaptive, then that's a different environment, and it needs a different set of coaching conditions to kind of promote that skill development. Does that make sense? I think it does. Yeah. So I mean, maybe we don't take that enough into account, you know, because most of us, I think, when we're coaching, we all aspire to get the best learning environment possible for our athletes, don't we? And I suppose we all want our athletes, ultimately, we hope they develop to become, you know, Olympic champions or whatever. I suppose we all have that aspiration to some degree, but realistically, the chances of that aren't particularly high. I mean, obviously, the number of people that go on to elite sport is quite low. And certainly I've had this debate at a philosophical level with, for instance, a friend of mine who runs a big soccer club in Salt Lake City. And we have the debate. He wants to create these sort of discovery learning environments where there's a lot of freedom on the kids to learn. And I can see that. But then again, he has the problem. The parents are going, well, you know, there's not as much coaching and instruction going on. And I'm thinking, well, what are you trying to do here? What are you trying to do? You know, are you trying to create Premier League players or MLS players, or are you just trying to get kids to learn skills and have fun and have a skill set that lasts them for life? So that's an interesting philosophy, I think, philosophical debate, which impacts on how you coach. And I suppose that the fundamental environment is very hard. I'm a kind of a strong believer that to some degree, as kids progress up the skill level, they need different types of coaching, different types of environmental structures. So you really need pyramid systems, whereby better kids are exposed to better coaches in more challenging learning environments as they progress through the system. As I said, I'm kind of there's mixed views on the specialization and diversification. It is very sport specific. I think it would be very hard to be an elite soccer player, for instance, if you didn't at least engage early in the sport. That is quite apparent. I suspect it is very hard to be an elite skier unless you engage very early in the sport. It doesn't mean that you can't participate in other sports. As I said before, there is no evidence to suggest that participation in other sports may have a positive skill transfer that would be a determining factor in reaching the elite level in the target sport. But there's no evidence to suggest that engaging in other sports is going to have any negative factors either. I mean, it gives them a broader set of skills, may help them in terms of socialization, developing some of the other psychological skills. So I wouldn't discourage kids from taking part in other sport. I suppose where it becomes difficult if engaging in other sports means that they're not accumulating enough time in the target sport for expertise, and then they end up with a practice deficit. I think skiing is a little bit different in this regard because it's seasonal, and the fact that maybe skiers end up accumulating more hours in more different sports than the soccer players probably reflects that, in the sense that 4 to 6 months of the year, unless they're traveling around the globe, then skiers aren't able to get onto the slopes, which probably naturally leads them to partaking in other sports. Potential downsides of early specialization, less so than early engagement, or sorry, more so than early engagement, could be potential risk of burnout and overuse injuries. I think that the risk of that depends on the level of passion and interest, and also the quality of the instruction and the coaching environments, and mediating roles in that particular process as well. Anybody want to ask a question on specialization with diversification? In terms of play versus practice, this is not so much, it's more to do with the quality of coaching actually than it is with play, with practice. There's quite a lot of data from some of the team sports that suggests that athletes who, for instance, are more creative, develop better decision-making skills, have accumulated more practice in non-coach-led play activity than athletes who are not quite at that level. I mean, they've all accumulated a lot of time in coach-led practice, but these elite athletes accumulated more time in play. Now, I tend to think that it's not so much the play versus practice, but is the extent to which it's hands-on or hands-off coaching. And we're coming back to this argument before in the sense that I think where you want athletes to be adaptive and creative, and you have to give them freedom to do that. Now, whether they do that on their own through street football, whatever the equivalent is in skiing, or whether they do that with the coach present, both are viable. It's just the coach has to create an environment where they can engage in free play activity, the street sport equivalent, if you like. So, as I said, it's not so much to do with play and practice, more to do with the role of the coach and the extent to which the coach is hands-on or hands-off when they're engaging in that practice activity. So certainly these play environments do have some benefit in regards to facilitating adaptivity and creativity. In regards to biological maturity and latent talent, I mean, this is the seasonal birth date bias. In fact, some of the things I'm going to briefly talk about, the book actually split into 3 sections. So the first bit highlights the involvement of environmental factors in the development of expertise. So we know, for instance, that siblings play a big role, and your chances of becoming an elite athlete are actually higher if you have older siblings. Okay, they're also higher, of course, if your parents have some interest in the sport, because ultimately, and particularly in sports that involve a fair amount of cost and or travel involved, then it helps, I think, if the parents have had some engagement in the sport. So having siblings, having parents is important. It's clearly important for a sport like skiing. 75% of Olympic skiers were born within 1 hour of slopes, which is not surprising. You know, you probably don't get many elite Olympic skiers from Texas, I presume. And there aren't many from the UK because we just don't have the snow. So the physical geography of where you're born impacts on the access to coaching, to training facilities, to level of competition, which are all very, very important. So, you know, there is an element of serendipity. I mean, not many of us are lucky to be born to parents who are interested in sport. Not many of us perhaps have older siblings, and none of us have control of where we're born and where we grow up during development. But all those factors have a very significant effect. A similar one is the month of birth. And I mean, the data is quite conclusive across a number of sports, and also the relative age effect has been shown in skiing. So in England, for instance, the academic year starts in September, but also the soccer calendar starts in September. So what you can see here is that from around 6,000 players who are registered at Premier League academies between the age of 9 and 16, almost 50% of those athletes are born in the first quarter, and only around 10% come from the final quarter. So what this highlights, of course, is the propensity of scouts and coaches to select boys and girls that are physically more developed at an earlier stage of learning. So if you're born later in the year, your chances of being selected are quite small. So there is a differentiation between chronological maturity, which is your stage of maturity based on your date of birth, and your biological maturity, in so much as that your biological maturity is your relative stage of growth and development relative to others within that same calendar year. And what you actually tend to find a lot is that even in this 10 to 12% of kids that are born June to August, the last 3 months of the selection year, so they're chronologically immature, but you'll actually find that they're actually biologically more mature for their age than those born in the first quarter. So what it highlights, I guess, is that if you're chronologically immature and biologically immature, your chances of being selected are relatively small. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end of the road for you if you're not born in the first 3 months of the year, because interestingly, when we've looked at sort of those who have got awards like most valuable player, FIFA World Player of the Year, the Ballon d'Or, European Footballer of the Year, there's a higher proportion of them that come from the final 6 months of the selection year. And surprisingly, by way of example, in the National Hockey League, salary is negatively correlated to the month of birth. So in other words, the earlier you're born in the selection year, the lower your salary, and the later you're born, the higher your salary. So I guess the question therefore might be that if these kids are disadvantaged early on because they're not physically the biggest and the strongest, well, they've probably got to do something to keep them in the game. So they either work harder on the development of technical, tactical skills, or they develop some of these psychological skills like grit, resilience, motivation, self-confidence that may allow them to continue engagement in the sport, such that post-puberty, when these biological differences have diminished, that they're still able to compete quite well. And we did have some data from skiing actually that we looked at recently. And we looked at practice engagements for kids across the 12-month period. And what we found is that the kids born later in the year had accumulated more hours in individual practice. So whether, again, that extra hours in individual practice allows them to develop better technical and tactical skills so they're still able to compete, I think is an interesting question. But it's been quite a robust finding. I mean, some people have tried different things like rotating cutoff dates. FIFA did that. They moved for football, they moved the start date from September to January. And all that actually happened is that the bias then moved to January. So if you rotate the cutoff dates, the bias moves with it. Unless, of course, you move it more than once a year. People have thought in terms of selection that they should have quotas from each birth quarter. More recently, there have been efforts to match on biological age rather than chronological age. This is a process of biobanding, so that kids are actually able to compete with people who are the same size physically rather than necessarily the same age chronologically. Flexible selection policy is one that allows kids, if they aren't selected into some kind of training program, to have the opportunity to come back at some later stage. And even at one level, the better identification of the age of players helps a lot as well. There was a very nice study done in Holland a couple of years back where what they did with young kids is they actually had the month of birth of the child on the back of the shirt. So, if you were born in October, you had month 2 on the back, and so on and so forth. And what they found was that actually putting the age of the child clearly numbered on the back of the shirt did impact on the selection decisions made by scouts and coaches. So even increasing awareness of how old the child is relative to others in the group seems to have a beneficial effect. So main conclusions. There isn't a gene or a reliable scientific marker that predicts success. I put football here, but it could be any sport, skiing included. It seems that motivation and persistence are key. We know that elite skiers start very early. We know they have an early engagement model. Yes, they participate in other sports, but they do accumulate a lot of hours in skiing. We know that practice is important. Yet, of course, the key factors here are that this practice needs to be effective. So the questions would be, I think it's important to make sure that coaches are as hands-off as they possibly can be in the instruction process, bearing in mind this balance between performance and learning, which also affects confidence, of course, because the problem is possibly if your environment is too challenging, then it affects confidence, which might decrease motivation. That's a difficult balance. But clearly we need to get the balance. We need to be aware of the differentiation between performance and learning. We need to get the balance right as coaches and with the individuals that we work in. We need to put as much emphasis on the learner to learn as independently as possible. And we need to create environments that are sufficiently challenging, that allow opportunities for athletes to grow. And I think that's the kind of main take-home messages. And the other thing is the concept of individual practices, you know, creating deliberate practice environments, as opposed to bearing in mind the individual differences across athletes and making sure that each athlete is being stressed and encouraged to develop as optimally as possible from each hour of practice. And maybe the final point just for me to close on is this concept of, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, for every hour of practice that you develop, you implement with your groups of kids, how much of that positively transfers to an improvement in learning? And what do we think that would be? I mean, of course, we'd all like to think it's 100%. So 100% of every hour of practice that we do transfers to a meaningful improvement in learning and performance. But obviously, it's not going to be 100%. But, you know, how high is it? 10%, 20%, 30%? Bear in mind this issue of the differentiation between maintenance training and growth training, and individual differences that exist across individuals. Normally the fact that we're working with reasonable sized groups of athletes, often 8 to 16 kids, then maybe that efficiency rate is going to be much lower than we think. But I guess the interesting question is, how do we raise the efficiency of practice and make sure that as much transfers from practice to competition as possible?
Great, thanks, Mark. Very interesting. You know, one thing, just to comment back, you talked about that you had the one slide in the circle, the physical and psychological attributes of a high level, I think, Manchester United player, right? And you know, we had a presentation from Gus Keating, who's a sports science data director for US Ski and Snowboard right now, and he shared some information on the highest level female US alpine racer, who was on the skills quest testing, who is not the best at any one test, but good enough at all of them. So I think there's a similarity there between, in terms of skills necessary for at least alpine racing, I would say, for a lot of snow sports, to soccer, in terms of it's not just one attribute or one skill that leads to international success. It's a combination of many. It's being good enough at a broad range of skills is what he was finding. And just curious if you see that in other sports as well, if that's a consistent finding.
I mean, it makes a lot of logical sense. I mean, as I said earlier, the challenge is we don't have a lot of longitudinal data. Whilst I fundamentally agree with that concept that you just raised, in the sense that it's rarely likely to be one or two factors. It's probably some combination of factors that come together in a meaningful way. But I suppose equally the reverse interesting question is, you know, are there limiting factors in so much as that, you know, do you need a certain VO2 max or a certain level of body fat percentage? And if you don't reach that minimum threshold, does that mean that you can't progress? I mean, I've argued for something called the compensation phenomenon. And of course, in a lot of sports, if you've got weaknesses in some aspects, then you can learn to compensate by developing strengths in others. So by way of example, in soccer, you may not be particularly quick over 5 yards, but it doesn't matter so much if you're able to anticipate and read the game a little bit better. I think the extent to which that can happen is probably very much sports dependent. You know, I guess soccer is very multifaceted. There's so many different skills, components, characteristics. There's so many different positions. I guess arguably there could be less place to hide on a downhill slope, for instance. And it could be that there might be minimum levels. I don't know, but we don't have any data, I don't think, to suggest that. Whereas I'm not surprised by what you're saying to me, but by any stretch of the imagination. But we probably only have data from a very small sample of people in that regard.
Okay, maybe something we look at going forward here. And I had one other question I thought was very interesting, and I believe it's from your most recent book, was that there's a study done on the hours trained by the very most elite by age 16 or 17 versus the sub-elite, but very, very, very close. Like this is like Olympic medal winners versus top 10 in the world. And that those who had achieved were, the very best in the world had actually trained less by age 16, 17 than those that almost made it. Is that, am I capturing that right? Am I looking at the right?
Yeah, no, I mean, there is data mostly from Central Eastern Europe, Germany, that suggests that. I mean, I think the challenges in some ways is that each sport is virtually very different and very unique, and of course, some sports are early specialization, or at least early engagement, and are very heavily dependent on technical and tactical ability. Others are more driven by physiological factors, and in those latter sports, it doesn't surprise me that specialization occurs much later. But I suppose what we can't do, I know we have this tendency by and large to kind of put a one-size-fits-all model on everything, but we really can't, and that's the problem. It's kind of the irony of it is, in many ways, isn't it, in the sense that most people expect science to be very black and white, but it's actually not. And it's actually, we've got the reverse scenario here, in the sense that I always say coaches or those that write popular science books think the world is black and white, whereas I, as a scientist, think it's 50 shades of grey. So, virtually, I can't say a conclusion without a bit having a caveat to it. And in that, even on that chapter that in the book that goes on early versus late specialization, I think we close it with a line that it depends. And there are so many different things where it depends on.
Right. So we might want to think about that. Yeah. Like what are the negatives of training a lot versus what are some of the benefits that, how can we mitigate some of those things, maybe to make it individual, right? I think that we need enough training. Practice is very important, but maybe it's a motivational factor with those kids who've trained a lot before a certain age, and some of these who have trained enough, but not too much, are prepared and ready by the time they're 17, 18 to really do the volume of training they need to be super elite, because it's going to take so much more. It's interesting. I agree that the lack of black and white there, and early specialization sports versus early engagement sports. I've been meaning to ask you about that one, so I thought I'd take the chance.
Yeah. I mean, there is some data, as you suggest. I think I'd have to be wary of what specifically I read into it. As I said, it's pretty much sport specific. Depends on the nature of the sport, I think, in regards to some of those kinds of issues.
Great, thanks.
I've got a question about, and Dave and I've talked a little bit about this, about resistant learners, ones that struggle when you provide different tasks for them and they really struggle to want to learn or to have a growth mindset. Is there any advice you have for dealing with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting, I just wrote a review paper actually last year on individual differences in skill learning, and going back over about 50 years from the 1950s onwards, there was a big, around the time of the Second World War, where they were trying to select pilots and deciding what factors would be important in choosing between pilots. There was a strong study on individual differences. And unfortunately, that area faded away. It was an area called differential psychology. And then it was replaced by more experimental cognitive psychology work. And most of the work over the last 3-4 decades has looked at groups. And, you know, when you talk about how best to provide instruction, how best to structure practice, how to provide feedback, it's mostly the result of looking at groups of individuals and how collectively people adapt. So what we don't know so much actually is these concepts around individual differences. So, you know, I can tell you conclusively that by and large, working with large groups of learners, then it's better to provide least instruction, repetitive, variable random practice, and least amount of feedback. But what I can't say to you, does that mean it's going to be perfect for everyone? No, there are going to be some people in there who might prefer to have lots of instruction, who might prefer repetitive block practice and lots of feedback. And there hasn't been very much work on that done at all in terms of individual learner preferences and how they impact on things. And I'm sure some of these other psychological factors come into it as well, in the sense that, you know, performance is probably lower if you're given less instruction and variable and dynamic. And some people can cope with that and some people can't. And maybe some of these issues around grit, mental toughness, self-confidence, self-awareness are all important factors, which we really don't know enough about. And ultimately, there's a lot of craft knowledge that comes in it from a coach's perspective, isn't there, in terms of knowing the learner and also knowing the learning environment and knowing how far you can push a child and how not to push a child. So I haven't got an answer to that. I'm aware of the problem, and I would imagine it's a common day-to-day problem for many coaches. I mean, ultimately, I suppose what tends to happen is that those who are able to cope with the most stressful environments progress because their skills get better, they continue to engage in practice, and maybe those who don't tend to fall away. Whether that's right or wrong or not, I don't know, but there's definitely an element of Darwinism to it.
I'm going to jump in with one more, Mark, here. I'm sure there's some other questions out there, but from last night, as I mentioned before, Jean Coté spoke to us, and one thing in his recent model for understanding long-term athlete development is this balance between developing motivation versus developing skill. And from you coming, that's sort of, I think, captures a little bit maybe with the different angles that you're coming to this topic from, where the skill acquisition versus the psychological aspect. And I think, you know, he framed it at younger ages, perhaps, you know, to focus more on the development of motivation. And as the athletes progress and get older, they're more prepared for more skill-based practice and more focused practice, and can have the psychological attributes to do that. I was just curious on your thoughts on this balance between developing motivation, which is important. All high-level athletes must be extraordinarily developed, right? We should be fostering that, but then we also need to develop those skills along the way. And what's that goal? So, kind of an open-ended question, but just curious in your thoughts on that.
No, it's a great point, and in some ways it answers Blair's question from a minute ago, doesn't it? In the sense that, I mean, clearly, if you do repetitive block practice, performance is good. It raises motivation. And maybe that then allows you to make practice a little bit more variable, random, and dynamic. Okay, performance is not so good, but they've already got high confidence by virtue of the fact that they've been through the repetitive practice bit. So yeah, it's a constant balance between that. You know, that of maintaining motivation and self-confidence whilst at the same time trying to provide a learning environment which is sufficiently challenging. And I think that's a great point. I come back to this issue though, and so I'm agreeing with Jean Coté fully. I come back to this issue though, in a sense, there isn't a recipe book for that though, is there? We know the basic concepts of it, but at the end of the day, when you're a coach and you've got the athlete in front of you, then the decisions you've got to make, got judgments on. And, you know, you can't go to 101 best drills for skiing. So you have to be aware of those issues, I guess, in the sense that
I think you bring up a really good point, though, that maybe they're not exclusive, right? Can you have skill-based drills and skill development activities that also promote motivation, right? Is that sort of the sweet spot? And not that they always have to be the same, but whenever possible, to maybe they don't have to just be one or the other. It can be both at the same time. And maybe we should focus on those environments that promote both at the same time. It's not just motivational or just skill development. It can be a skill. Yeah. It can be a drill that is very motivating.
Yeah. I suppose there's almost at least two aspects to this motivation, though, isn't there? In the sense that at one level, it's this success v failure, and I get the argument being the more you succeed, the more enjoyable it is. But then on top of that, I guess there's something like the intrinsic nature of the activity as well, in the sense that from a soccer coaching perspective, for instance, playing in a small-sided game where I'm shooting, passing, running, dribbling is enjoyable, intrinsically enjoyable, whereas maybe getting success on a repetitive drill is success, but it's not so enjoyable in terms of the nature of the activity. So I guess it's got to be some combination then of this awareness between the balance between performance and learning, and success and failure, linked in also with the nature and type of the practice activity that they're engaging in.
Great. I'm sure there are a couple more questions out there. I don't want to take up too much of your time, Mark. I know it's getting on there, but I'm sure.
Yeah, it's okay. I've got a few more minutes. I mean, also, I think the Jean Cook points is an interesting one, but does it, I mean, again, a lot of intrinsic motivation comes into it, doesn't it? In the sense that, you know, with some kids, there's so much passion and interest in the sport that drives them on, whereby this kind of feeling of being uncomfortable, not being very successful in a particular practice session doesn't influence them very much, because their motivation is so high to be successful. I suppose the point I'm making is, while agreeing with Jean Coté, I'm still in the back of my mind thinking whether there are some genetic factors here about the fact that people who really reach that level are just such high levels of motivation and grit and passion and interest that whatever it takes, they're going to get there. Now, are they born with that, or is that developed by the environment, or is it a bit of both? That I'm not so clear on.
For one kid, the most motivating session will be the one where they failed at everything and they were just challenged by it. Whereas another, the most motivating will be the one where they could do everything and they won. They felt good right after it. Right? It's not. It's completely individual, really.
Yeah. So I suppose my point on Jean's model is it seems to be quite a logical model that would fit a large number of athletes, but would it fit experts? Don't know. That'd be an interesting question to ask him. I agree with his principle, but you know, by definition, experts are outliers, aren't they? So they wouldn't be like the rest of us.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Does anyone have a burning one? Well, Mark, thanks for your time. A great presentation again. Very great to touch base with you and connect to last year's presentation as well. I know you're presenting to US Ski and Snowboard, their fall seminar series for coaches education as well, coming up here in a couple of weeks. So be sure to catch that as well. I think it'll add to this too. So Do you have any interesting research you're working on now? That we can have an insight on.
Well, there's always research ongoing, I guess. I think we're going to start doing some stuff on. I think we've just reached out to some of the ski clubs. Actually, we're going to do some stuff on sleep and learning. Some interesting arguments around the fact that we actually learn when we sleep through a process of consolidation. So there's a lot of interesting what that's looking at napping and what the benefits might be of having a short nap in between practice sessions, for instance, as to whether that might facilitate skill learning a little bit better. So I have a PhD student who's interested in doing some work in that area. So if you might be interested in being involved in data collection at some point, I might reach out to you later.
Yeah, this fits well. I think we're kind of moving more into this side of things and providing some more support off the hill, outside of practice to athletes too. This could be definitely an interesting area for us. So keep us updated.
Yeah, no, I will do. But that's moving it a little bit more into the neuroscience area. But it's an interesting question around sleep and how variation in sleep impacts on learning. And that's both long-term sleep, of course, and the potential benefits of short-term napping and things of that ilk are quite interesting.
Great. Interesting. Well, thanks again. We'll let you go. Thanks to all our coaches for joining, and we'll see you in a couple weeks here with USSA Coach Zed as well.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.